Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all to this online seminar, which is hosted by the specialist construction team at Shepherd and Wedderburn. This morning's seminar topic is contracting in a challenging market, and we have four speakers from our specialist team. First of all, we have Ewan Murray, who is a partner in our construction and engineering contracts team, and he has a particular specialism in procurement law. And then we'll hear from Gwen Napier, who's a director in our specialist engineering and construction contracts team. And thirdly, we'll hear a joint presentation from Chiara Pieri and Lisa Ambrose, who are respectively an associate and solicitor in our construction and engineering disputes team. So this morning, the specialist topics that we'll be looking at are firstly, Ewan will be speaking to the topic of an overview of the construction market, and Ewan will be looking at some of the statistics, which sections of the sector are performing well, which are performing less well, and what the challenges and opportunities are that we see arising in the coming 12 months. And Gwen Napier will follow, and Gwen will discuss supply chain management and look at some of the particular challenges around supply chain that we're facing at the moment. And finally, Chiara and Lisa will speak to managing and mitigating risks. So looking at some of those challenges and what you can do to help avoid risks coming to pass, and prudent steps that you can take in managing your projects. So those are the individual talks. Now we plan to run this seminar until 10:15 at the latest. It will be followed at the end of the talks. There will be a section for Q&A. As you're all on mute, there's no chance for you to ask questions live in the seminar. But what you can do is type them in during this webinar. You can type your questions into the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and we'll pick those up at the end of the talks and discuss them then. And if time runs out, we'll come back to the whoever asks the question. We'll come back to you by email individually. So as I said, we plan to run our talks until 11 o'clock. And this seminar will close officially at 11:15, sorry. So we hope to have at least 50 minutes for Q&A towards the end. There will also be a poll at the close of the talks, and the poll question will be, which of the following do you think is the biggest challenge facing the construction sector in the next 12 months? And the possible answers will be A, financial pressures, B, supply chain issues, and C, insurance. I'll give you those questions again at the end of the talks for the purposes of the poll, but I thought it helpful to raise those questions now so you can think about it during the presentations. Then we can have the poll and give the results live during the webinar. So that's the introduction. I'll now hand over to Ewan Murray, who will give the first talk. And Ewan, as I said, will look at an overview of the construction market today.
Thanks very much, Ian. So hopefully everyone can see the slides on the screen. That's obviously just the topic there. Chiara, if you can skip to the next slide. So what I am going to do is in effect a little bit of scene setting, which should hopefully provide a bit of context for Gwen, Chiara and Lisa's talks that will follow on. I'm going to have a quick look at some high-level market statistics, then overview of the sectors, as Ian said, touch on the challenges and trends, some of which the remainder of the team will then discuss in a bit more detail. Touch a little bit on some reasons for optimism, and then a quick look at the end at what's in store for 2023 in terms of the construction sector. So if you can flip us on to the next slide, Chiara. So this is a sort of mixed bag of statistics, really taken from a range of sources, including the ONS and also the Scottish Government details. So in terms of the general economic output, wider than just construction, ONS has UK GDP estimated to have grown 0.3% in January, but that was after a fall of 0.5 in December 2022. And the ONS has said GDP was fairly flat for 3 months to January 2023. Inflation's obviously the big thing that everyone's talking about. CPI in December 2022 was 10.5%, which is down from a high of 11.1% in October. So it is going down slightly, but still obviously quite high in the grand scheme of things, which is clearly having an effect on not just the construction sector, but everyone's day-to-day lives too. In terms of the construction sector more specifically, from a UK perspective, monthly construction output is estimated to have decreased by 1.7% in January 2023. Excuse me, with a 4% fall in new work in January 2023. In terms of materials, and I'll come back to materials and the burden that that's putting on the construction sector slightly later on, statistics are showing 7.7% increase in terms of materials for new housing projects to January 2023. That's looking against January 2022, and a 13.3% increase in other new work. What about Scotland itself? Output fell from the Scottish Government stats. Output fell in 3 months to November by 0.2%, so slightly less, I suppose, than the wider UK. And the one thing I would say in terms of housing in Scotland still seems to be quite positive. There's a 9% increase in all sector homes completed to June 2022 last year. Although I would say a large part of that figure could be driven by local authority and housing associations. There's a 27% increase in local authority new build completions and a 21% increase in sort of affordable housing new build completions. So that's a kind of general snapshot overview of the market. And then if we move now just to have a think about how that's playing into some of the sectors or how the various sectors are performing. As construction professionals, we're obviously involved in construction and engineering projects across a vast range of sectors. And what we would say as well is that's obviously across the whole nature of the supply chain. So from employers at the top down to contractors and subcontractors. What we would say across the various different sectors is offshore energy at the moment is obviously a real driving force. UK is a global leader at the moment in offshore wind, and the Crown Estate notes that offshore wind's already providing about 8% of national electricity demand. The UK government has a target of achieving 50 gigawatts of offshore capacity by 2030, which is obviously not far away, and that in itself provides, so beyond the market pressures around supply chain. The scale of offshore and the number of projects out there will obviously put its own pressures on the supply chain, as a lot of developers will be looking to secure similar products, similar materials, similar contractors, shipping, etc. So that's interesting. Very busy at the moment. Onshore energy also quite busy again, I would say. We're seeing quite strong growth in battery storage projects and also solar projects, both standalone and co-located with existing wind. And then the other thing that's on the horizon, I think, at some point is offshore wind and repowering older wind farms. Obviously, turbine technologies have come on leaps and bounds since the original days of wind. So we might see that over the coming years too. So quite buoyant sector in energy. And last year, Renewable UK reported that wind power, so both on and offshore, reached a milestone of 25.5 gigawatts, which is enough to power roughly 19 million households a year, about 2/3 of all UK homes. So renewables providing quite a lot of energy generation. Heat networks, I think, will be something that we'll see a lot more on. Industry is expecting, particularly in Scotland, government regulation to come out in this year, which will include the ability to set up heat network zones with a single operator, which I think will drive investment in heat networks. And the other thing that's not on the slide, but that we're seeing a bit more of on the energy side, is hydrogen production, whether green hydrogen co-located with a renewable asset. That's something we're seeing a lot of interest in at the moment too. And then next slide, Kiara. On the property development side, so leaving energy aside for the moment, housing, as I said earlier, is still going quite strong. There's a Scottish Government target to deliver 110,000 affordable homes by 2032. 9%, I said on the first slide, increase in new build homes. Although the counter to that is it's a little bit of a mixed bag. So there is a 13% decrease in new build starts in the year to June 2022. But there has also been a 4% increase in private new build sales to August 2022. Wider property development, I would say the sector's still quite busy, particularly given the challenges that Gwen will come on to talk about. One thing I think we all thought we might see was office developments dropping off, or a change in approach to office developments with people taking smaller spaces. I'm not sure we've necessarily seen the level of drop off that we anticipated on that, and there's still quite a lot of traditional office development going on. I would say we are seeing a continuing trend in construction widely of two-stage tendering, and I think the benefits that that brings to the employer, for example, is greater cost certainty. From a contractor perspective, there's also benefits to it because it enables the contractor to provide a better program and take account of risks, etc., in pricing as you go. In terms of funding for projects, debt's still quite hard to come by, so we are seeing some more deals being funded by equity. That could, I guess, be due to the macroeconomic situation and the strength of the pound and dollar, etc. So yeah, seeing a little bit more equity investment in projects. And if we move on to look at challenges and trends, what I would say is we're still very much seeing the current market as a contractor market rather than an employer market. Inflation is probably, excuse me, is probably one of the key things that everyone's talking about at the moment. And inflation in terms of rising costs and economic uncertainty does tend to lead to delays and cancellations. We're seeing a bit of interest at the moment in fluctuation provisions, for example, in JCT and SBCC, and indexation, sort of X1 provisions for NEC. I won't talk too much about that at the moment, as I think Gwen will come back to talk about that in detail. And in terms of other challenges, as we said on the first slide, the cost of materials is obviously increasing. There's tightness in the supply chain and labor issues, which is affecting everyone because obviously from a contractor perspective, it's challenging to find the right skilled workforce and secure the materials, etc. And from an employer perspective, that obviously puts pressure on pricing. And the other thing is we're still seeing issues in the professional indemnity insurance market too. I'm not going to talk about any of those in any detail though, as I think Gwen will come on to cover those in a bit more detail later this morning. And if you could just flip to the next slide. So that said, I think there are still quite a lot of reasons for optimism. As I said on one of the previous slides, the office development market still seems to be going stronger than we perhaps thought it was. And in terms of financial performance, anecdotally, I would say we've probably seen fewer insolvencies within the construction sector than we had possibly anticipated would come down the horizon. And the Bank of England has said that they think large house builders are saying that their output is supported by strong order books. As I said, the energy sector is continuing to perform really strongly, and I think will do so because will continue to do so because of decarbonisation targets. And public sector investment still quite strong as well, with some significant projects, particularly down in England and Wales. You have the UK government commitment to its new hospital programme, which is promising 48 new hospitals by 2030, which is probably the largest hospital build programme in a generation, I would say. HS2 obviously still ongoing, huge project, and things like the UK government investing 700 million in the Sizewell C project. So still quite a lot of public sector investment. And as I said, a lot of public sector and housing associations still investing in housing. Won't go through those stats again. In Scotland, the SFT have noted that future planned Scottish public sector construction projects likely to have a value of 12.2 billion. So still a strong requirement for infrastructure in the public sector. And in wider property development, I would say hospitality and hotel deals still going strong, and build to rent and student accommodation also still strong areas where investment in construction is moving. So there are reasons for optimism. And just touching now on what's in store for the rest of 2023. Not really going to go into any detail in any of these. It's just an overview snapshot. But in England and Wales, you have the procurement bill currently going through Parliament. So that will change the way that the public sector procures infrastructure contracts going forward in England and Wales. It's intended to be a single set of regulations rather than the multi-regulations that we have at the moment, and provide a more flexible route to public procurement in England and Wales. It's going to allow for a competitive tendering procedure, for example, which gives the contracting authorities more flexibility to structure their own procurements than is currently the case. Obviously, that will be seen as a benefit from the public sector perspective, but could be slightly more challenging from the perspective of bidding contractors if lots of authorities take lots of slightly different approaches to procurement. The Building Safety Act, everyone will have heard of, I'm sure. Many of the changes from the Building Safety Act already in force, including the changes to the limitation periods, which you'll all be aware of. But there is still secondary legislation coming out. So, for example, this year we've got the Higher Risk Buildings Descriptions and Supplementary Provisions Regulations 2023, which provide effectively the position on what constitutes a higher risk building. There's two different regimes there, one for the design and construction phase, which, for example, includes hospitals and care homes, and then a separate definition of high risk buildings for the operations phase, which doesn't include hospitals and care homes, interestingly. And I think that is because the view is that they are workplaces and therefore already covered by more stringent legislation in relation to fire safety by that route. I think in general, we will continue to see a focus across all sectors really in construction on ESG issues, so environment, social and governance issues. And I think particularly interesting in property development, I think we might see a move towards addressing retrofitting existing buildings to try and decarbonize existing buildings. And I think there'll continue to be a push on modern methods of construction, including modular building, which people have talked about for a few years now and just seems to continue to gather pace. And then finally, the last thing to touch on is just that we're aware that there'll be a new suite of JCT contracts due later this year, JCT 2023. We don't know yet what will be in those. If I were to speculate, I would imagine that it may have been delayed in terms of ensuring it can pick up any changes required as a result of the Building Safety Act, and also things like ESG issues, because everyone will probably have seen that NEC released a sort of climate change clause X29 recently, and I suspect JCT may do something similar. We don't know that for a fact. We'll just need to wait and see what comes out, but those are the types of things I suspect may come through in JCT 2023. So to summarize, I would say still a very challenging market for construction. There's still quite a few specific challenges, which I think Gwen will come on to talk about in a moment. But there are also, I think, reasons for optimism. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleague Gwen. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ewan. So today I'm going to look at some of the issues currently affecting supply chain management in the construction industry. As we're all very much aware, events over the last few years, such as Brexit and COVID-19 pandemic, have all contributed to issues with material and labour shortages, causing disruption to the supply chains and rising raw material costs. Rising energy prices in the Ukraine war have resulted in the industry being met with further uncertainty, and it's expected that these issues will continue further into 2023, coupled with UK-specific pressures such as rising inflation. So shortages of materials and labour, increased cost of materials and fuel, and rising inflation all impact on construction projects and create uncertainty in respect of both costs and delayed programme, two of the key factors in construction projects. So what are we seeing are the consequences of these? Well, the global supply chain issue leading to longer build programmes and higher costs is causing some contractors to shy away from projects with bigger risk profiles. Indeed, some projects are getting very few tenders at all. The rise in material prices and time is taking to source products means that contractors are unable to hold prices post-tender for too long, and we are seeing contractors and suppliers seeking additional time and money from employers where they can't get critical components. There's a post-Brexit labour shortage in the UK construction industry, as many European labourers have returned to the EU, which means that clients may need to pay more to get the right specialists on board. And in respect of the war in the Ukraine, some contractors are in fact now looking for relief in the event that the war extends beyond the borders of the Ukraine, given that this will further affect supply and manufacturing and impact on the availability of goods and materials. Some contractors are even looking for time and money for anything at all that impacts the works arising out of the war in the Ukraine, feeling that they just don't want to bear this risk. So how are these issues being dealt with in practice? A new slide, Cara, please. So advance orders, one way to mitigate the risks of supply chain uncertainty is for advance orders to be placed for materials, and this is likely to require the employer to make advance payments. This may provide more certainty as to cost and also reduce the risk of delays. So the usual rationale for these payments is to assist with the cash flow required to cover initial expenses, such as ordering items of equipment with long lead times, to allow early design work and for labour mobilisation costs. The employer will usually require an advance payment bond from the contractor, where the contractor requests an advance payment to cover the cost of securing materials ahead of work starting, and this will protect the employer if the contractor fails to fulfil its obligations or it becomes insolvent. Off-site material agreements. So this in turn requires the parties to think about ownership of materials when in storage, as well as where the materials should be stored. Clients are looking for off-site material agreements to be entered into so they can ensure they own the materials where they are located or stored off-site when they are ordered earlier than they are being incorporated into the works. As usually payment is made until materials have been delivered to the site. So this is a cash flow consideration, and the employer may need to pay these costs up front. As I mentioned, it also leads to issues around where the materials will be stored, who pays for the storage costs, as well as who takes the risk for damage and who insures them when they are in storage. So all of these points should be discussed and included in the off-site materials agreement. Provisional sums. We're seeing an increased prevalence of provisional sums, and contractors may seek to include provisional sums for those aspects of a project that are hardest hit by uncertainty and price fluctuations, although this then may make tenders less competitive. Clients often want more control than a provisional sum gives, however, and it may prefer to agree a benchmark price with a limited mechanism for price fluctuations. I think over the last 12 to 24 months, it's been more difficult to achieve a fixed price, and we're seeing more detailed discussions to address legitimate contractor concerns. Parties sometimes trying to find a mechanism which often turns out to be bespoke, or a relevant index is used rather than the fluctuation options in the standard form contracts. However, it does seem that it will only be a matter of time before parties start to use the fluctuation provisions contained in the standard forms. So I thought it would be useful to spend a little time looking at these today. So most developers and lenders will not accept fluctuation provisions in building contracts for the main reason it creates price uncertainty as to price in a situation where there's a finite amount of funding available. In fact, use of the JCT fluctuation options was so uncommon due to long periods of low inflation that when they released the 2016 edition, the JCT removed 2 of the 3 options from the standard form. So B and C are only now available online, although there is some talk that this may change. So only option A remains in the actual hard copy standard form. So transferring the risk of fluctuations in cost onto the contractor doesn't particularly create a competitive cost for the employer. However, the risk is still present. Either a mechanism is included in the contract to deal with that risk, which provides some contract comfort to the contractor, or the contractor will simply price that risk and include it in its lump sum tender. In both cases, that risk has still been valued and it's still been paid for. So therefore, what a lump sum contract actually represents is the maximum commitment really of costs which an employer is willing to bear in exchange for not having to be concerned about fluctuations in the contract price. And the potential benefit to the employer, if it were to consider using a fluctuation provision, is that contractors may well be prepared to bid much lower in the knowledge that they'll be compensated if prices rise. So there's no reason to front load the risk in the lump sum tender in this case. So what are fluctuation provisions? Well, these are optional contractual provisions designed to deal with the effects of inflation and changes in costs. If a change occurs which is captured by a fluctuation provision, an adjustment to the contract sum is made. And the adjustment, unless the contract is expressly amended to say otherwise, can result in either an addition or a reduction to the contract sum. I think a common misunderstanding is that fluctuation provision will only apply to the betterment of one party, which is not actually the case. So in the JCT SBCC forms, there are 3 fluctuation options. Option A is entitled Contribution Levy and Tax Fluctuations. So these provide for adjustments to the contract sum for alteration in contributions, levies, or taxes payable by the contractor, or alteration in statutory refunds receivable by the contractor. Option B, deals with labour and materials costs and tax fluctuations. And when incorporated, this option allows the contract sum to be adjusted for fluctuations to the cost of labour, materials, goods, fuel and electricity, and includes changes to taxes and statutory duties affecting these. So option B operates so that if market prices for materials, goods, electricity, fuels, or other solid, liquid or gas necessary for the execution of the work increases or decreases from the market price of the materials at the contract's base date, then the net amount of the increase or decrease can be assessed and included in the valuation of the applications made by the contractor. The parties are still able to agree the amounts payable, and there's no alteration to the contractor's profit as a result of the additions. Contractors can't benefit from their own delays by use of the fluctuation provisions, as the contractor is not entitled to an adjustment for periods beyond the completion date when it's responsible for the delay. Finally, option C. So this is a formula adjustment, and option C provides for adjustment of the contract sum in accordance with the formula rules published by the JCT. Option C is, we understand, reasonably easy to operate for technical teams, QSs, and whilst not necessarily taking account of actual costs, is generally considered to be a fair adjustment. Most fluctuation provisions are calculated by reference to published price indices, such as the Government Inflation Index, Consumer Prices Index, CPI, or other industry published reports. And the parties can choose how prescriptive, simple, or complex the provision should be. It could be as simple as allowing price increases in line with CPI, or it could be as discrete as applying only to changes in price for one specific material. So just turning to look briefly at the NEC contracts, some of the NEC suite of contracts provide for price adjustments for inflation through a secondary option X1. As you'll no doubt be aware, the NEC contracts take a different approach to the JCT contracts, and in the NEC engineering construction contract, the approach also differs depending on which of the 6 main options the contract is based on. So the main options A and B, which are the lump sum options, place the risk on the contractor, with options C and D, the target cost options, splitting the risk between the parties in accordance with the pay gain mechanism. So under these 4 main options, it's also possible to include the secondary option X1, which would allow the contractor to be reimbursed for price increases that occur after the commencement date. Option E is cost reimbursable, and option F, a management contract, place the risk of price increases on the employer. So the fluctuation provisions of NEC, the ECC, are not as detailed as those contained within the JCT contracts, and instead of using the term fluctuations, secondary option X1 refers to price adjustment for inflation. So it's really been several decades since the construction industry has seen prices so volatile, and with this expected to continue throughout 2023 and possibly beyond, parties will need to rely on their contracts to protect their position as far as they can, and contractors may wish to mitigate the risks of price increases. So consequently, clients can expect more and more contractors to ask for the inclusion of fluctuation clauses, and there's likely to be increasing the amount of negotiation on this issue, especially in respect of larger long-term projects. I think the key message is that adopting a fluctuation provision does not mean limitless cost exposure for the employer or unrestricted recovery for the contractor. Incorporating fluctuation provisions into the contract could provide the benefit to the employer in that contractors may well be prepared to bid much lower, knowing that they'll be reimbursed for rises in prices. When clients attempt to transfer the risk of fluctuations and costs to the contractor, it doesn't mean there's no cost for the client. Either a mechanism is included in the contract to deal with the risk of fluctuations in price, or the contractor will price the risk and include it in his tender. Contractors may even wish to submit 2 bids for each project, one tender being on the basis of a contract containing fluctuation provisions and the other significantly higher, with the contractor taking on the risk of price increases. And if the contractors don't get contract provisions they seek, though, they should be aware that they will be willing to walk away from tenders at the moment. So certainly the drafting and practical operation of both fluctuation schedules and inflation adjustment mechanisms require detailed consideration. What else can employers do to protect their position in terms of the current issues? Employers can tighten up their position by making sure their contracts include certain other terms. For example, they could put an overall cap on the employer's liability for additional duties and tariffs and cost increases. They may even wish to put a cap on the length of the extension of time that can be awarded. For example, the extension of time won't be in excess of 6 weeks. They could put in, they should also make sure that contractors should have taken such reasonable steps as would be expected of an experienced and competent contractor to mitigate the effects of such implications on the works and contract, including trying to procure goods and materials and deploy staff in the UK to avoid, where possible, any new tariffs, duties and labour restrictions. Other things to currently be aware of, and that's a new slide, Chiara, are subcontractors. So it's essential that contracts both up and down the contractual chain are back to back and have similar provisions with respect to pricing adjustments. You wouldn't want a situation to arise where a fixed price was agreed with the employer, but a price adjustment option had been given to subcontractors, or if price inflation occurred and the subcontract had not yet been entered into. So it's important to reflect the provisions in each contract to ideally place them as near to each other as possible. Always check the contract terms. As we've seen, the present economic and political environment can leave contractors and employers exposed to rising prices and an unpredictable delay. So the first thing to do is to check the contract terms, and it may be that such a price fluctuation clause or relevant event for extension of time allocates risk. Parties need to be aware of contract terms and where the risk of uncertainty lies. I think at the moment, everyone has to be very commercial. And it might be worth looking at other options to see if some provisions can be renegotiated to allow risk to be more evenly shared, to allow works to be completed. Steps may need to be taken to ensure orders are placed in advance and attention is paid to procuring key materials, and keep an eye on the market to ensure that purchases are made at a sensible time. Employers should also bear in mind that if a contractor is struggling to stay afloat, following price rises and delay, this may subsequently cause loss and delay further to the project. So a commercial approach to a solution may be required. Where it's clear there's no leeway for the contractor in terms of a price adjustment, and the price increases are at the point of making the project commercially unviable for the contractor, a sensible option may be to try to enter commercial discussions with the employer, and opening up channels early between the parties can allow for pragmatic solutions to the rising costs within the supply chain. For example, it might be that in return for shouldering some of the burden on costs, an employer may seek an expedited programme. This would make sense in industries such as energy, where bringing energy projects live earlier than anticipated can allow them to benefit from the increased energy costs, recouping some of the increased construction costs. Alternatively, there may be an option to discuss alternative suppliers of materials, perhaps those that can reduce shipping costs, for example. So essentially, where there's no room for price adjustment for the contractor, it'll be a commercial decision for the employer, depending on the project and the circumstances as to whether it wants to assist the contractor. It may be better for employers to renegotiate and risk the contractor falling into insolvency and being unable to perform its obligations, which in turn could cause further delay, disruption and increased cost. So lastly today, I was going to talk on another important issue we're seeing affecting construction contracts, which is professional indemnity insurance. So unfortunately, the hardening of the PI market still persists. We continue to see increased policy excesses and high premiums, and some contractors are finding PI insurance too expensive or not available. We're seeing PI insurers offering aggregate only cover rather than the more traditional any one claims basis, and there are caps sometimes with a mix of aggregates, sub-limits, particularly with respect to claims related to pollution, contamination and asbestos. We're seeing overall caps and sometimes complete exclusion in respect of fire performance materials, cladding or wall systems related cover following Grenfell. And this has actually led to some firms stopping carrying out cladding jobs as a result of the insurance hike. So these restrictions are preventing contractors from obtaining certain types of new work, and in particular their ability to carry out remedial work on high-rise buildings. And high-risk projects are therefore only available to those who are able to procure cover. So we're finding this is actually driving the selection of contractors and consultants, and we have actually seen some contractors and consultants being replaced by others due to one party not carrying the requisite amount of PI insurance or not on the required terms. We're also seeing design and build contractors being more careful where they're taking on an innovative design team, given that they'll be inheriting any exclusions and limitations that have been included in the consultant appointments. So I think more diligence is required around insurance early on in the process. Contractors and consultants need to make sure their contractual liabilities are covered by insurance. Supply chain management is critical, and it's important also subcontractors are not getting hit with late payment and PI increases. In some surveys, certain construction professionals are saying they feel the market is stabling slightly despite the remaining challenges ahead, and they're seeing that rates continue to harden but at a more reasonable level. We are yet to see this in practice. So to an extent, there's little a developer can do to reduce the risk posed by the current PI market, but nevertheless, there are some practical steps a developer faced with these difficulties can take in order to protect their position. So if they encourage early engagement, so the consultant or contractor can secure the required cover at the most reasonable price, confirm the PI being offered to the consultant is both market standard and the maximum possible, and ensure consultants are only undertaking duties that are within their capabilities, and ensure any subcontractors being engaged maintain sufficient PI, specifically in relation to cladding. Due to the claims-made nature of policies, developers should encourage consultants to regularly assess projects they're involved in, and terms of the policy are set to be, if the terms of the policy are set to be varied on renewal, developers should request that consultants review any circumstances which may give rise to a claim under the current policy. There can be a tension between the services and the PI cover that's available, and we have, as I said, seen that responsibilities reallocated. There does need to be a bit of a check as to what is achievable and what there is cover for. So those are the key issues that we are currently seeing in the market. So I think overall, in order to avoid programme delays and additional costs, employers do need to look at perhaps being more commercial outcomes in respect of how risk is apportioned, and certainly listen to what the key issues are that contractors are facing. A detailed review of the contract terms that will be entered into between the employer and the contractor should be undertaken. And I think employers will need to take a more pragmatic view, and hopefully both parties can have a conciliatory approach to projects moving forward. Thanks very much. Now over to Lisa and Chiara.
Thanks, Gwen. So in the current market, managing and mitigating risk really should be an important consideration for everyone who's contracting in the construction sector. There are ways in which employers, contractors, subcontractors can protect themselves, and Lisa and I are planning to discuss the various ways in which you can do so throughout the life cycle of your construction projects. We aim to cover topics on the slide here, so security packages and financial diligence, caps on liability and enforceability of those caps, contract management, no loss arguments, and termination. So before even thinking about entering into a contract with another party, it is really important to undertake financial diligence, and it should also be undertaken throughout contract management. What do we mean by that? Well, you should check the financials of the contracting entity, whether that be developer, employer, subcontractor, and you should continue to monitor the ongoing financial solvency of that entity throughout your construction projects. It can be easily done. You can check Companies House website, or there are various websites which can provide financial reports on companies. So it's an easy task that won't take you long. If the solvency of the other party doesn't look promising, then it would be wise to obtain company guarantees, or PCG. As I'm sure most of you will know, a parent company guarantee is generally provided by the contractor's parent company or ultimate holding company, which will usually then allow the employer to call upon the parent or the holding company to remedy a breach by the contractor, or to complete works or pay damages if the contractor is in default. However, that does depend on the wording of the PCG, but a well-drafted PCG will allow an employer to recover from the parent company all losses and expenses that it has or will incur as a result of insolvency, for example. And for contractors, it's also possible to obtain a payment guarantee from an employer's parent, so it's worth bearing that in mind. And whilst it is all well and good obtaining these PCGs, they are only worth whoever is providing them. So Remember to also check the financials of the parent entity, particularly if they aren't based in the UK. And again, just continue to monitor their ongoing financial solvency throughout the life cycle of a project. Another option is obtaining a performance bond or guarantee. Note there is a difference between an on-demand bond where there's a primary obligation on the issuer to pay without having to prove that there's been a breach or commence proceedings, and a guarantee where the person calling on the guarantee would need to establish liability. And a performance bond is usually provided in favour of the developer or employer by an independent financial surety, which is often a bank or an insurance company. The expiry of those bonds or guarantees should ideally be at the end of the defects period, but more commonly we're seeing these being pushed towards expiry at practical completion. If it's a timed bond, then you'll need to ensure that that's renewed as needed. Be sure to know what is required to access it. As I mentioned, is it on demand or does it require some sort of determination before you can access it? Gwen's touched on insurance already, but you should really ensure that the party that you are contracting with does have the correct level of insurance in place up front, and that insurance policy is with a worthy insurance entity. It doesn't stop there. You should also then follow through with that and actually ensure that the insurance policy is renewed on a yearly basis, and make sure you request that new certificates are provided throughout the works as needed. I'm aware that you'll all have requirements under your contracts to provide these relevant security packages, but you need to make sure that it's not just a box ticking exercise and that it is followed through with and kept on top of. I'll pass on to Lisa.
Thanks, Chiara. So another important aspect of managing and mitigating risk is how parties choose to allocate risk between them in their construction contracts, and specifically via caps on liability. Most of you will know what this is, and you'll know that it's nothing to do with the picture on the slide, but I will briefly just cover what the fundamentals are of caps on liability. So a cap or limitation on liability is a clause which restricts the damages payable by a party to the other up to a certain financial sum, either in relation to specific issues or for all claims under the contract. Caps on liability can be expressed as either a lump sum or a fixed amount. They can be a percentage of the fees due under the contract or the contract sum, or they can be by reference to the level of PI insurance to be maintained under the contract. And three aspects of the liability cap to consider will be the level of the cap, which is quite a difficult balance to strike, because on the one hand, you want to adequately protect the interests of the employer, whilst on the other, not exposing the contractor to an unreasonably high level of risk. Secondly, you want to consider the basis of the cap. So does the cap cover each and every claim, or is it for all claims in the aggregate? And finally, you want to consider if there are any exclusions to the cap. Now, a recent case of Benkert UK Limited against Paint Dispensing Limited provided a useful illustration of the need for careful drafting and negotiation of liability caps. So in this case, the Inner House of the Court of Session rejected a challenge to the limitation of liability clause on the basis that it was an unfair term under the Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977. This case was a £30 million damages claim for a factory fire. However, the contract capped paint dispensing liability to just over £3,000, which was a fraction of the claim value. Benkert argued that Section 24(3) of the Unfair Contract Terms Act applied, which states that when considering the reasonableness of upholding a term in a contract, regard should be had to whether it was open to that party to cover himself or herself by insurance. Paint dispensing did have public liability insurance in this instance. However, the court took a robust approach to the clause and confirmed that the cap on liability was enforceable. Benkert was a large, well-resourced company, and it was able to negotiate on an equal footing with paint dispensing. Despite this, Benkert opted not to negotiate the clause, and importantly, the court held that paint dispensing's public liability cover was irrelevant to the reasonableness of the cap. Now, this clause is a relatively extreme example, but it does demonstrate the importance of reviewing such clauses carefully and at the negotiation stage pushing back on caps which don't adequately protect your interests under the contract. The courts are unlikely to rescue a party from what might retrospectively appear as a bad bargain or an unfair term in a contract. So moving on to contract management, we've now covered things to look out for at the drafting or negotiation stage of a contract. So I'll just briefly consider the ways in which parties can manage and mitigate risk during the running of a project. Although it might seem obvious, the importance of good contract management throughout the life of a project cannot be stressed enough. So Ewan and Gwen touched upon a number of pressures on the construction industry that we're seeing at the moment, which will have an impact on the way that contracts are run. So for example, those contracts which were entered into before the effects of inflation or material shortages were fully felt are likely to see an uptick in, for example, the number of compensation events that are being issued under those contracts. And that's just to mitigate the effects of those pressures. For employers, this will result in a greater administrative burden. However, no matter how many compensation event notifications are being issued, the provisions of the contract apply in the same way. So please be mindful of any timescales for responding to these compensation events. Otherwise, some can slip through the cracks. We also recommend considering the compensation events in your contract carefully and seek advice where necessary on whether certain events apply or don't apply under the contract. For contractors, where the contract requires you to submit an early warning of an event, where possible, make sure you do so. Make sure you check the notice provisions carefully and make sure that you adhere strictly to the contract, even although parties have been doing them in a different way since the beginning of the contract. Although often you can demonstrate a course of dealing in these sets of circumstances, it can cause issues if contracts are quite prescriptive as to the form and content of notices. We know that parties can sometimes be concerned about how it might look to be issued with a whole raft of compensation event notices, or on the other hand, a whole raft of rejections of those notices, if the relationship is good during the running of the project. However, this can always be managed by, for example, picking up the phone to the party on the other side and just explaining that you're simply protecting your position under the contract. It's always better to do that than to not issue the notice under fear of offending or upsetting the other party, only to be faced with a dispute further down the line. So the final practical point that I will make on the managing of contracts is the management and retention of all relevant documents during the project. We see time and time again situations where agreements have been made over the phone or on site, which haven't been properly recorded or documented, which obviously means it's extremely difficult to prove that that agreement took place if there's going to be a dispute further down the line. Similarly, we've seen situations where our clients have quite short document retention policies, and that's for both electronic and hard copy documents, due to the costs of storing and organising these documents. However, this can cause a serious headache when faced with a dispute, and there's no documentary evidence to back up our client's position. These short document retention policies are already unsafe when faced with the time in which parties can bring claims. So usually in 5 years in Scotland under the law of prescription and 6 or 12 years in England and Wales. However, as Ewan briefly mentioned, the introduction of the Building Safety Act will bring this issue even more into focus, given claims can be brought up to 15 years or in some cases 30 years after the right first accrues. We strongly advise having good document management systems in place and to keep documents as long as it's economically practical, even if they're archived and kept somewhere else in case such a dispute arises. So on that, I'll just pass back to Chiara, who will cover no loss arguments.
Thanks, Lisa. So no loss arguments. Well, we wanted to raise it really just so that people on the call are aware of what the no loss argument is, and really in order to protect themselves, as where it's used successfully, it can potentially mean that the party who suffered the loss can't recover sums from the party who's caused the loss. In England and Scotland, it's a general rule under English and Scots law that damages for breach of contract are intended to put the innocent party back in the position it would have been had the other party complied with its contractual obligations. And it's only the person who has suffered the loss that can recover damages. The no loss argument or defence is used to describe the situation where a party argues that although they have breached their legal obligations, the other party has not suffered a loss by reason of their breach. And this situation can result in a black hole where the party who has breached the contract escapes any liability because the other party can't show that it suffered the relevant loss and they have no cause of action against the contract breaker. So in construction, this situation can arise quite easily. I'll give you 4 examples. One, the person suffering loss has no contractual relationship with the person responsible, for example, developer and subcontractor situation where there's no collateral warranty in place. Secondly, weaknesses in equivalent rights of defence or no greater liability clauses, which might prevent recovery if the clause isn't drafted well or widely enough. Thirdly, where 2 parties have assigned the benefit of a construction contract from one to the other, and in a subsequent claim, a defender argues that the assignee may not recover more than the assignor would have done. And fourthly, where a party fails to properly transfer rights and obligations under a novation agreement. So it's therefore extremely important that you ensure you are properly protected in these scenarios. You can ensure that you've got appropriate collateral warranties in place, make sure you're obtaining legal advice on clauses and any changes made to the clauses, as well as on assignations or novation agreements. And this kind of no loss argument has been considered quite recently in a number of Scottish cases. I'm just going to take a quick look at the last one there from 2022, the Court of Session case. So this case concerned upgrading works. It was the SRB's Civil Engineering UK Limited case. And this case concerned upgrading works to junction 1A of the M9 at the Queensferry Crossing. As a result of company reorganisation, there was a wish for the SRB UK company to be the party to the design and build agreement that was originally between SRB and Scottish ministers. SRB UK and the Scottish ministers entered into a novation agreement which substituted SRB UK for SRB in the design and build agreement, and an assignation was later entered into between SRB and SRB UK. Later on, defects were found in the pavement of the motorway, which SRB UK attributed to breaches by Ramble, who were the party who provided the design services. And SRB had assigned its rights to SRB UK so that the SRB UK company could be compensated by Ramble in relation to its liability to the Scottish ministers. Now, the SRB UK company then brought proceedings against Ramble, in which Ramble argued that SRB's obligations under the contract had been extinguished as a result of the novation agreement, and therefore any loss which it might have suffered was avoided, and as assignee, SRB UK could not recover any greater loss than SRB could recover. So luckily for the SRB UK company, the court rejected Ramble's argument and found that the legal effect of the novation agreement was that the UK company had been substituted for the previous SRB company, and there was no practical difference between the loss which SRB suffered and the loss which the SRB UK entity suffered. I think the case highlights the importance of properly considering the impact of innovation on associated contracts and liabilities. How is the situation avoided? Well, using the case as an example, at the same time of the novation of the design and build agreement, SRB UK could have requested that Ramble provide them with a collateral warranty for their services under the Ramble contract, and that would have then established a contractual link between SRB UK and Ramble. The Ramble contract could have also been novated to the SRB UK company at the same time as the novation of the D&B agreement was carried out, and that would have ensured that there was no question as to who Ramble owed their obligations to. And it might also have been helpful for the assignation of SRB's rights under the Ramble contract to have been made at the same time as the novation of the design and build agreement. So Be aware of where you might sit in that contractual chain and consider who's impacted. It would always be wise to obtain legal advice when you're entering into any novations, assignations or collateral warranties. Okay, I'll pass back to Lisa now, who's going to touch on termination.
Thank you. So the last issue that I will touch on briefly, just in relation to the management and mitigation of risk under construction contracts, is effective termination. Now, obviously, this is not where parties want to get to, and it's hoped that termination can be avoided through some of the measures that we've covered today, whether that be at the negotiation or the drafting stage, or at the contract management stage during the running of the contract. However, sometimes you exhaust all other options to you, and termination is the only option that's left under the contract. Or in other circumstances, you can be faced with an insolvency event which forces you into termination of a contract. So again, we are stating the obvious here, but just to kind of bring them into focus, the key questions that you need to ask yourself if you're considering terminating a contract is, firstly, can you terminate? So check the provisions very carefully against the circumstances that you find yourself in. If the other party has become insolvent, how do you know that, and how is that going to be evidenced in any sort of notices? Is the type of insolvency included as a termination event? So for instance, if it's administration, is that specifically covered under the contract? If the termination is for reasons with issues with performance, how are those measured under the contract? And are you certain that those measures haven't been met? And if it's a payment default, are there other provisions in the contract that allow the party to pay late with other consequences such as interest that would have to be exhausted before you terminate the contract? So if you pass all of those hurdles, the second question you need to ask yourself is, how do you terminate? We recommend reviewing the notice provisions under the contract, then reviewing them again. Since the consequences of termination are significant, the notice provisions tend to be quite strict. So make sure the notice is addressed to and sent from the correct parties. And that includes if there's specific email addresses or postal addresses that need to be included. Does the notice have to be sent in a certain way, whether that's RD or email? Make sure that it refers to the correct clauses under the contract. So the clauses that you're relying upon for the termination. And also make sure that it adequately identifies the reason for termination rather than being too general to be considered a valid notice. So then if you get yourself to the final question, you have to consider what happens after you terminate. So does the contract provide for the financial position post-termination? So for example, are outstanding invoices to be paid? What happens on site? Are there provisions in relation to the vesting of any plant or materials that are owned or hired? Or does the site have to be secured after an insolvency event? Does the contract specifically provide for the recovery of the cost of a replacement contractor or a subcontractor post-termination? Or is this something that's unclear and that would have to be disputed upon after termination? So when you've asked yourself those three questions, consider again whether termination is the right choice. As mentioned, the consequences can be drastic and the effect of an invalid termination can be even more drastic. So we highly recommend reading your contracts and being careful. And on that very cheerful note, that concludes our discussion of ways to manage and mitigate risk under construction contracts in the current market. And I will now just pass you back to Ian, who will round up our discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all of our speakers. I hope that's given you some food for thought, both in terms of the state of the construction sector, the challenges that we're facing, but also the opportunities that Ewan touched on, and some of the detail of all of that Gwen spoke to, and then ways of mitigating these issues and making sure that when you adopt a course of action, you follow that through in accordance with the contract and all the steps that are necessary. So thanks to all of our speakers. Now, in the remaining time available, which is 15 minutes, what I'd like to do is first of all do the online poll, and then we have some questions for our speakers. So firstly, we have an online poll. If I could ask, please, all of the audience just to click one choice. You only get one choice, so it's one of these three. Which of the following do you think is the biggest challenge facing the construction sector in the next 12 months? And is it financial pressures, and examples are inflation, insolvency, security issues, or supply chain issues? And we've given the examples there of availability of supply chain disputes with supply chain and so on. Or thirdly, insurance. And that would be the types of issues that Gwen was talking about, the availability of PI cover, cover restrictions, the cost of cover, etc. So can you choose one of those three, please? And I will reveal the results in just a second. So I'll give you just a short time to complete that. Okay, and can I ask our administrator please to reveal the results? And there we are. So actually that's interesting. That's a very clear result from the audience in favour of financial pressures, inflation, insolvency, security issues, supply chain issues obviously coming second, insurance third. So actually that's very interesting. I think for myself, I thought things might be a bit closer between all of them. That's very interesting. So I think that's an interesting poll for us all to take back to our respective businesses, that really the financial pressures and what that sort of captures is the issue that probably the majority of us think is the biggest challenge in the next 12 months. So we should take that back to our businesses and I guess adopt some of the practices that have been spoken about today to mitigate the risks of those things happening. So thanks very much for taking part in the poll. That was very interesting. Okay, so let's turn now to some of the questions that we've received, and thanks very much for all of those who've asked questions. We actually got a question in advance before this seminar, so I'm going to put this to Gwen, please, because I think it touches on what you presented to. And the question is as follows: how can contracting firms best position themselves in the market in response to the challenges that are being faced?
Thanks, Ian. Well, I think the main thing to do is flush out the issues as early as possible, discuss the key points between the employer and the contractor. Obviously, as we've mentioned earlier, check what PI cover you have, and highlight to the employer what's available and any restrictions, limitations in that cover. I think on the technical side, identify early on materials you're going to need, speak to your suppliers in advance and order, make sure you're able to order any long lead items. And I think basically read the contract. It's more important than ever to read your contract and negotiate as required between the parties. Discuss, as we've mentioned, price risk and fluctuations, where that risk is going to lie. So I think the main thing is to be prepared, really, flush anything out at the start. Yeah, just be open and commercial, I think, between the parties.
Okay, thanks, Gwen. Now the next question is for you, Ewan, I think. And it's as follows: why are we seeing fewer insolvencies than expected so far this year in the construction sector?
Thanks, Ian. It's quite a difficult question to answer, I suppose. I mean, I think anecdotally, I think everyone recognises the benefit in having a robust supply chain. So it could be that people are managing supply chain payments more effectively than historically. For example, I think some of the things Gwen was talking about earlier about people entering into commercial discussions earlier in the process and actually tackling things like long lead items or advance payments or reservation agreements and things like that may also be helping. But I suspect there's no one answer to that. I think it might be a blend of answers, Ian. I think it could be that the supply chain is working together a bit more, from employer down to contractor down to subcontractors. And I think people recognize the benefit of having a more robust supply chain. And at the same time, open communication contract management, which Lisa touched on, you know, at all stages of the supply chain. So from your employer to your main contractor, and then your main contractor with subcontracts, which I think Lisa touched on. Or I suppose it could be that it's delayed and we'll still see insolvencies. Hopefully that's not necessarily the case, but it is a possibility.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. Okay, now thirdly, Chiara, you mentioned collateral warranties, so I think this is a question for you. What do you do if a party who's agreed to provide a collateral warranty, then refuses to do so?
Thanks, Ian. Well, following on from what Ewan said, I'd hope that, you know, if there was good and open communication, then you wouldn't, you know, find yourself in that situation. So it's definitely important to keep up a good rapport with whoever it is you're contracting with. But I would expect it to be a requirement under building contracts or appointments to provide a collateral warranty. So if it's not a requirement under your contract, step one would be to update your contract and make sure that it does provide for that, to make sure that it is, you know, there is an obligation on them, and make sure that there's a time scale for that to be provided after signature of the contract. If it's there already and the time scale's passed and you've still not got it, and your communications have broken down, it's probably at the point where you want to formally write to them and request it. And if that's not forthcoming after, you know, a couple of attempts, then you can consider asking the court to order that it's provided at that stage. I'd say the courts are generally willing to kind of order specific implement in these scenarios in Scotland. So basically they'll order the other party to do so. And I think it's, you know, there was a case a couple of years ago in the Outer House in the court session, and it's been considered by the TCC. So, you know, if there's obligation there and they're not providing it, then you can go to the court and have it ordered that they do provide it.
Okay, thanks, Chiara. Now I have a question, I think probably relates to the Building Safety Act for you, Lisa. So it's as follows: how long can you reasonably be expected to keep documents, bearing in mind the new extended claim periods under the Building Safety Act? So you mentioned 30 years. Is that a sensible period, or is that excessive?
So it's a good question, and to give a typical vague lawyer's answer, it's a bit of a balance. On the one hand, if you get rid of documents too quickly, it can be detrimental to both you and to the other party if you do end up in a dispute. Because for instance, if you want to try to rely on those documents further down the line and they're not there, or if you're served with a disclosure or a specification and you can't comply with that. However, we do know that it's expensive to store documents, whether that's electronic or in hard copy, and that companies will often have to take a view on this. The 30-year period under the Building Safety Act does only apply to retrospective claims, which arise before June 2022, although in theory it can be just before that date and then run for 30 years from then. So we would say, as kind of cautious lawyers, keep the documents as long as economically possible from PC. Maybe not all of the documents, maybe just the kind of key ones that relate to the building itself. That doesn't mean all emails that have ever been sent in relation to a building, for instance. And HSE do state on their website that the information that should be kept in relation to a building or a project should be proportionate. So keep that in mind, but we would always say keep as much as you can for as long as you can.
Okay, and certainly be wise for contractors and others to be reviewing their document retention policies and just thinking about those carefully. Yeah. Okay, well that's great. I think that concludes all of the questions that we have. So thanks again to our speakers for answering those. So I'll now draw this seminar to a close. Just a couple of points before I go. Firstly, there will be a link sent to all audience members to a recording of this webinar. So feel free to share that with your colleagues. We're very happy for you to do so. The slides will also be circulated to you in the same message. So have a look out for those. They should come to you shortly after the seminar. And then really, otherwise, it just remains for me to say thanks very much to all of the speakers, but also thanks to you for dialing into this seminar. As always, we very much welcome any suggestions, as to timing or format of our seminars or topics. So, feel free to email us after the seminar with any thoughts on that. Also, if there's any questions that occur to you after the session, then again, feel free to email those directly to our administrator, who will send you the slides and the recording of the seminar. So thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for tuning in. And we hope to be able to speak to you soon, and hopefully see you in person also. Okay, thanks very much. Bye now.